right, so thanks everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for colleagues joining from different regions. I'll start with a introduction to this program, and then we'll introduce ourselves as speakers of this session. So first of all, welcome to the Building Climate Resilience into Construction Industry session in the Resilience and Disaster Risk Management Week of GPAL Learning Days. It's called Spring into Learning. There are many more webinars like this that are happening in this week. In case you missed them, you can always visit the catalog. You can watch the recording. These sessions will be recorded and maintained on our website. And the details, we are going to post them on the chat. If you go to your browser and type GPAL Learning, you would be able to access all the recording of all sessions. Okay, with this, I wanted to start introducing the speakers of the session. And if I may, I invite you, Aris, to start introducing yourselves and then other colleagues.
Thank you, Ahmed. Great pleasure to be joining this panel for this session. I'm Aris Papadopoulos. I'm a engineer by training, a retired construction industry executive, having been almost 30 years in the construction business. I've also helped the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction established a private sector initiative starting about a decade ago, which is now known as ARISE globally. Since retiring, I've become the Distinguished Expert of Resilience at Florida International University and founded the nonprofit Resilience Action Fund, and I'm the author of the book, Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Aris. May I invite you, Olivia, to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, thanks, Mohamed. Hello, everyone. I'm Olivia Brower. I'm the FIG Upstream Global Lead at IFC, FIG being the Financial Institutions Group. We work mostly with financial institutions and microfinance institutions. Within the upstream team, we are looking at strategic business development with investment horizons of 12 months to 5 years. Our projects and activities are aimed at identifying and addressing market gaps, which will help create the market conditions to attract capital and private sector investments and making projects bankable. Within the FIG Upstream activities, we are focusing on 5 main areas, being climate change, demographic change, technological change, capital markets, as well as distressed assets. So the presentation today falls squarely within our climate change activities, and we've been working closely with Ahmed and his team on the Resilience Index. So nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivia. Great to have you here. Angelo?
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm Angelo Tan. I'm an operations officer under IFC's Climate Business Department. In terms of my role, I'm the country lead for the EDGE, Green Buildings, and Building Resilience Index programs, leading the country-level implementation of both these programs here in the Philippines. I'm a trained industrial engineer, and I did my Master of Sustainable Built Environment in Australia, and I have a decade of experience in real estate development management, commercial real estate, and architecture business development. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. And myself, my name is Omid Saberi. I'm the industry specialist for green buildings within the Climate Business Department of IFC. Also, I've been the technical lead for the EDGE Green Building Program, and most recently, we started working on the resilience in buildings. So these are the programs that I've been working on. I also wear a hat of supporting IFC's investments on the financial institution group, as well as other groups like infrastructure and manufacturing, agriculture, and agribusiness and services. to convert the buildings toward green and resilience buildings. With this introduction, I wanted to get started with the presentation, and thank you for joining us. During the presentation, we would be posting a survey link toward the end. Please fill the surveys. If you have any questions, please either post them on the chat or keep them to the end of the session when we have a section for questions and answers. Excellent. Okay. So, as I mentioned, this specific session is going to speak about building climate resilience into construction industry. And this has been more and more important given the backdrop of what's happening globally around natural disasters, and it has been top of the mind for many of the organizations, including World Bank Group. We just saw the IPCC report was published a couple of weeks ago, mentioning the importance of resilience in all sectors. Also, UN and COP26 mentioned that the investment in resilience has been underinvested among the other sectors when you compare it to mitigation. So this is important for sector for investment. But before we talk about what we are trying to do, I want to tell you a story. This story is a real story in Caribbean, and this image would give you the context of the story. So there was this village in Caribbean islands that hit by a hurricane, the entire island hit by a hurricane. And people in the village were devastated because their houses and buildings were damaged, the roads were damaged, infrastructure was damaged, and there was no way for them to go out or for the support to come in. It would have taken a few days for the government to get their support to get to the village. But interesting enough that there was one building in the middle of the village that was kind of a community center. And the community center was built quite well. And it had solar panels as well with batteries. And that one building at night stayed light with electricity, with power. And people, they could gather around that building, charge their phones or listen to the news and understand what's going on outside that village. And that building itself acted as a place for people to come together, acted as a place for people to have hope and light in the middle of the night where everywhere else was dark. With this story, this is exactly how important it is for us to bring resilience and continuity to the assets so that we can continue operating buildings after each of these disasters. So what are we going to cover today? We are going to talk about these few elements. I'm trying to keep the agenda quite light. Number one, we would be introducing what Building Resilience Index is. We're glad to have Olivia and Angelo here to talk about Philippines and Caribbean islands and our program there. And then we will talk about the role of World Bank and IFC in resilience in construction and in buildings. What can we do? There would be a call to action, and finally there would be a survey. May I request, if you are not speaking, to keep your devices on mute, just to reduce the feedback. So I wanted to just give you a backdrop of what's happening in the World Bank itself. So within the World Bank Group, there is the action plan, which calls for 3 simple actions. Simple, not too simple, but the message is simple. Number one, we are going to boost our direct adaptation financing to 50 billion between 21 to 25. We are already halfway there within that time frame. We will be also increasing our support to the countries to increase the support on resilience and risk reduction on climate, specifically on climate. And number three, we need to develop new rating systems. And these rating systems are backbone of any action we take because it defines the eligibility of construction assets that would be eligible for adaptation financing, but also it would be important for third parties to understand how to define a building that is resilient against a building that is not resilient. So the story of our work started with EDGE Green Building Program, and the EDGE program within IFC has been one of the most successful programs that IFC developed on acting on climate. The EDGE program now has been adopted in more than 100 countries. We have facilitated more than $7 billion of investments in green construction. And the program not only being a standard within IFC, but being recognized globally with standard setters by the financial institutions. We also have commercial banks and international banks adopted EDGE and using EDGE in different countries. With that experience, we looked at what can be done for Building Resilience Index. And the Building Resilience Index is an extension of EDGE program. To look at the reasons why we should do this, if you look at the, I'll call this slide a major crossroad in human history, because it is really a time for us that we are either going to win this battle, or as humanity, we are going to lose this battle. And the time frame is very limited. We have the time between now to 2050, which is only 28 years. If you look at the carbon emissions, the carbon emissions are still on the rise, even if that there has been a lot of talks and a lot of discussions around reducing carbon emissions. A lot of countries, they have their plans to reduce carbon emissions, but they are yet to be implemented. So the carbon emissions and reducing that is still a challenge. There's a lot of programs and support there. If you look at the natural disasters, they are being on the rise. Between 1970, the graph on the right-hand side, 1970 to 2019, you see that the weather-related natural disasters are on the rise. And the graph at the bottom shows that not only we have increased disasters, but people are moving more and more to cities. So our cities are going to be more populated. But this population in the cities are not, they are not all building very good construction. So not being building good construction, having increased natural disasters means that it's a time bomb, and it will come back, and at some point we would be paying for these disasters. So if you look at the history of these disasters, on the left you see the cost of these disasters in different years in US dollars. And you would see that these costs are increasing year by year. And if you look at the colors, the orange shows uninsured losses, and green shows the insured losses.
Ahmed,
Yes.
sorry, there's a notification on the lower right for a meeting reminder. It's covering the lower right of the screen. Thank you.
Thank you for.
That's better, thanks.
Thank you. Do you see the lower right fully?
Yeah, it's better now. Yeah.
Thank you. So when you look at the losses, you would see that different type of disasters bring large amount of loss to different countries. And sometimes these losses in some of the Caribbean islands can be 200% of the GDP. So these losses are quite heavy when it comes to the countries to deal with the aftermath of these losses. So who pays for these losses? This is a very interesting study done in Turkey. The source is given there. The interesting thing is that, not surprisingly, a lot of these payments are coming from the individual savings. So if you look at here, the majority of the payments are coming from people paying out of their pockets to recover. The second one is self-insurance or business reserves that pays, and then it goes to commercial loan insurance. Interestingly, insurance is number 4 paying for the disasters. And this is more acute when you look at the developing countries. If you come to developed countries, probably insurance share is higher, but when you go to developing countries, insurance share is much lower. But why do we need to invest in resilience? If you look at the cost-benefit ratio, the numbers here are from National Institute of Building Science. For example, if you look at wind, the green bar, for every dollar that you invest in resilience, you would be saving $10 in repairs for after disaster. So for example, let's say your roof is weak, you pay $100 to fix the roof. When the disaster happens, you're saving $1,000, 10 times more. And this is very important because, if the banks and the owners, they understand that these kind of savings are going to happen, then this is a really good investment. You can't invest in anything that pays back 10 times. And this study has been showing that mainly in the countries where the codes are weak, the investment even pays back higher. When the codes are better, the investment, obviously the margin of payback is less because the codes are covering part of the resilience already. So what we have done, we looked at and we did market studies in Caribbean islands as well as in the Philippines. The findings were quite interesting because when you look at the findings of what happens in the current conditions in the country, there are 3 areas that the study looked at. We looked at the people and policy, looked at the financing and money and technology. If you look at the people and policy, the weakest point there is verification. The robust verification does not exist in the urban settings, and it doesn't exist in rural settings as well. So that's one of the weak points. Even if there's a code, that code has not been verified on site. The second, that is all yellow, which means that it's quite weak, is the financing. So the financing doesn't really exist much for resilience. And there's a lot of the banks, they do not provide specific tools or solutions for financing resilience. And finally, if you look at the technology already more or less exists in our target markets. The only part there is training and awareness building that needs to be emphasized. So that gives you a context of where we are and what is the context of the countries. With this context, what would be the solution? And here I'll pass the mic to Aris to talk about Building Resilience Index. Aris, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Omid. I'm very pleased to be involved in this initiative and commend the World Bank and IFC for creating a first of its kind for buildings way to measure resilience. When we can measure things, we can better reward them, incentivize them, and make them transparent. And when a building in the future will have both a edge good rating and also a building resilience index good rating, it will truly be sustainable. And I like to say personally that if you have to build a building twice, it's really not sustainable. So this initiative aims to have both a robust metric, because for resilience, nature is the ultimate tester, and we will be tested, but also a metric that can be easily applied on a mass scale. So the Building Resilience Index includes the components of first identifying the risk, and that is location specific. In other words, when a location is entered into the application for that building, the application will select what hazards are applicable to that specific location. And we'll discuss the hazards that are covered. Second dimension is managing the risk, and that is done through a list of 74 what we call mitigation measures or resilience mitigation measures, and we'll be discussing those. And finally, there's the disclosure of the risk to the concerned and interested stakeholders, which in my view should include even the public. Next slide. So we talk about the four major hazard categories that basically define the natural hazard a building will typically be exposed to. And when you look at insurance data, 85 or more % of economic losses are due to one or more of these four categories. So these are wind, water, fire, and geoseismic. Many of these are climate related, some of these are not. So the index aims to be comprehensive in terms of encompassing everything. And under each of these categories, you can see hazard types. For example, for wind, it can be a downburst, a simple, strong wind that is present almost anywhere in the world, or a tornado if you're in a tornado-prone area, or a storm, which goes under different terms depending where in the world you are. Hurricane for the Americas, cyclone for the Indian Ocean, and typhoon for the Pacific Rim area, the Asian Pacific coast. And you see the different other ones under water, fire, and geoseismic. What we identify here in the red box are default hazards. In other words, no matter what location you're in, certain hazards will always apply. There are rains even in deserts. Fires, local fires can happen anywhere, and ground subsidence is a phenomenon that can occur anywhere. But the application will be able, with the location, to identify the applicable hazards. And basically, we are looking for two things here. One is the physical integrity of the building to be able to withstand the hazard, to resist the hazard and survive the hazard. And second is the operational continuity. In other words, if the building survives, then will it be operational? Will people be able to use it and function properly? So the index addresses both of these. The next slide. And by the way, this index applies to all types of buildings, from residential to office to commercial to public buildings. It does not apply to infrastructure, which I understand is the subject of a different metric that World Bank is developing. So how are buildings rated? This is a dial of a five-level dial that I understand has been adapted by the World Bank for many different metrics. And I'll explain what each of these mean from A+, A, B, C, and R. So we wanted to create a index here that essentially sets the bar high, because as we know in the building industry, codes are essentially set at levels not to preserve the structure, but to enable people to escape. So to preserve the structure, you need typically a higher standard than what even the good codes today provide. Of course, certain regions may have excellent codes in one particular hazard that is very strong in that area. So we created essentially the A level and A plus level to be above code, code plus. And to do that, we essentially compiled, we created a global expert team of resilience experts in the construction field, and compiled something that doesn't exist anywhere. What are the global best practices for each of those four major hazard categories? So A really represents a level of global best practices. For example, for wind, we took the standards for South Florida, the Miami area, which I personally live in and has probably the best standards today that have been used for wind. For seismic, we took the standards that are used in Japan, and one of our experts, Kit Miyamoto, came from that part of the world and is a global expert on at global best practices for all the four major hazards. The difference between A and A plus is that A plus is essentially an A with a minimum number of what we mentioned before, operational continuity measures. So there are 10 measures provided in the index, and I believe if you meet at least 4 of these 10 and have an A already, you can rise to an A plus level. B would be a strong code in a location. C would be a weak code, and R would be either a very weak code or unplanned, unpermitted development, which we see a lot of, especially residential, in the developing world. So the aim here is really to get buildings to go from R to C, from C to B, from B to A, and hopefully from A to A plus. If we looked at most of the buildings today, even in developed countries, we will find most of them being in the B and C categories, and very few being in the A. And of course, in the developing world, we'll see many more in the R category. But by setting the bar and having the scale, we aim to show people using this index what it will take to go from R to C, which measures need to be included either in new construction or in retrofits to be able to do that, or from C to B, or even from B to A. So the metric, the index itself will provide the information that the users can see and say, okay, what do I need to do to get to the next level? And we've also done a cost analysis to provide some indicative costs of what each of these measures may cost. Of course, costs in construction are very localized, but this is kind of an indicative information that a study that IFC commissioned compiled. Let's move on to the next slide, please, Omid. Because I think the next slide we show, if you can do that, we show the logic, one of the principles that we've applied. I'm not seeing the next slide yet, but I'll keep talking.
Next slide is on weak, because link is already on. Probably your system is putting it here.
I can't see it. Hopefully everyone else can see it. For some reason I can't see it. The weakest link principle essentially is that we do look at each of the four hazards and rate each of the four hazards individually, and the overall rating for the building is essentially the lowest of the four. Now, this is a strict kind of principle here, but we know that nature will essentially find your weakness, and at some point will that vulnerability will be the one that you suffer. Now I see it. Thank you. So this should incentivize buildings to say, okay, I'm doing well, let's say in fire on the left here, but I need to improve my geoseismic resilience. So what measures do I need to take to go from a C to a B there? And if you do that, then your overall rating would be a B. And then if you wanted, of course, in this case, to go from a B to an overall A, you'd have to work on certain measures on wind, on water, and on the geoseismic to get them to the A level. So that's the overall logic here. We're not averaging as typically is done in energy efficiency and environmental footprint measures, because really nature acts on buildings on each of these applicable, if they are applicable, let's say, to that location hazards individually. Next slide, please. Hopefully I can see this one. Okay, yes. This is just for example purposes to understand a little bit the logic of the mitigation measures. And this is specifically for the hazard category of geoseismic. And I won't go through each one of these individually. You see here 18 measures. Overall, all four categories have a total of 74 measures. So some of these measures are location specific, because location does affect the resilience of the building. In other words, the more vulnerable, let's say, the location is, the more engineering and cost to address that vulnerability. So if the location is safer, that is definitely a plus. The bottom two here are, or three in this case, are engineering related measures. In other words, certain engineering that has to be done for the building, and also the inspections that need to be done, because it's not just designing something, it's making sure that it's built properly. And the verification process, we'll talk a little about a bit later, will involve professional engineers essentially signing off for the building. And the middle ones essentially are individual measures. And you can see here, kind of in the middle here, which ones are applicable depending on the hazard of that location. And then for the ones that are applicable, there are certain measures that are must-haves to be an A metric, and all of them are must-haves. Must-haves to have a B, and even fewer must-haves to be at the C level. So the logic, once the applicant, let's say, verifies which measures have been designed and constructed in the building, then the application itself will go through this checklist of must-haves and say, yes, you have the minimum must-haves for this level, and therefore this is your rating for that hazard category. Next slide, please. Okay, there's some delay in me seeing the slides. Which is the next slide, Ahmed?
So this slide is about the verification and how the project gets verified.
Yes, basically, this is a self-declaration for the buildings. In other words, we're asking the buildings to, through their code responsible engineers, essentially complete this application. We are asking for the licenses to be uploaded of those engineers. So the code responsible engineers, and in the case of most buildings, the slides disappear totally from my. In the case of most buildings, okay, yes. So this is a disclosure of risk slide. Yes, in the case of most buildings, we will require two engineers. It could be the engineer who originally designed the building and someone else. For smaller buildings below a certain size and below a certain height, we will only require one, so that smaller facilities are not financially burdened as much as large facilities. But still, that engineer will have to upload their license. And we've also discussed that there may be periodic audits, random audits of buildings to make sure that they are properly following the procedures. For the Philippines, where this was initially tested, we tested about 10 different facilities of different types around the country, and we fine-tuned the application. As we go through this launching phase in the Philippines, we're getting feedback, and we may be improving the user guide that gives a lot of detail for what each of the mitigation measures means, to make sure that people understand them and complete them properly. And we will be aiding individual facilities, initial facilities, through the process, and training the verifiers, the engineers, on how to properly apply it. Next slide, please.
So here I'll invite Olivia. Olivia, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Iris, for the great presentation. So here, this is to present some of the activities that we've been doing within the Financial Institutions Group. We are working on a program called the Resilience Building Program for the Caribbean, where we are looking to use the Building Resilience Index that was just presented and that has been developed in the Philippines to other regions which are prone to climate events. So the Caribbean is obviously a clear choice. It's a region that's highly vulnerable to climate events, as we can see on the slide. There's been huge damages and losses incurred over the years in the region. One example is Hurricane Maria in Dominica in 2017, which caused $1.3 billion of damage. We've seen over 400 plus natural disaster events in the region since the 1950s. And we estimate that it takes about 3 years to see a full reconstruction of Dominica after Maria. So I think that there's, and especially given the data that we're seeing, and with climate change and with the expectation that natural disasters will increase in number, but also in strength, we see an urgent need to strengthen the region's ability to cope, to manage, to recover from natural disasters. And using this tool, we see it as bringing great potential to do this. So in the context of the program, we conducted a market assessment exercise in the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Dominica to understand what the market's gaps are in order to increase or enhance resilience in those countries. And some of the key market gaps that we identified are as follows, and which Omid also alluded to earlier. Some of the islands don't have standardized building codes or are looking at focusing on one natural disaster and less on others. There's a lack of capacity and expertise to implement these codes. So even if you have codes that are established, they're not always implemented as they should be. And there's also a lack of quality control. There is also limited capacity of the private sector to determine what qualifies as climate resilient buildings. There's no rating system to know what it is and how we get there. In terms of the financial sector, which is what we focus on in the Financial Institutions Group, there's no specific product that targets resilience. Financial institutions have the standard products, personal loans, but nothing that really aims to look at enhancing resilience of housing, buildings, etc. So that these are some of the key gaps that we've identified during this market assessment. The other thing that we did during the market assessment was also to present what the Building Resilience Index would do. And the feedback from many of the stakeholders was that this would be a very interesting tool for them to use, and that it could fill some of the gaps that we have identified. So in terms of the next steps for us, so we are under the program, what we would like to do is help develop and adapt the Building Resilience Index for the Caribbean, as well as see how from the investment and advisory side, we could encourage financial institutions to do more and build resilient portfolios of housing and buildings. So in terms of our current activities under the program, we are engaging with several financial institutions in the region to pilot the tool and test it out. We are working with Iris here to customize the tool to the Caribbean region and look at the hazards and the mitigation measures. And all of that work hopefully will lead to the program being mostly operational by the end of this fiscal year, so being by the end of June 2022. So it's definitely something that is needed for the region, and that we're pushing forward, and we're seeing a lot of interest for. So hopefully we get there by June 2022.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Olivia. And this is really good example of how IFC can implement this. And obviously, Caribbean Islands, and as Olivia said, is a natural choice similar to Philippines. But this is a program that can be extended beyond these boundaries to wider reach. Here, I'll pass the mic to Angela to speak about our program in Philippines a bit more. Angela.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. So for this part of the presentation, I'll talk about the Building Resilience Index pilot here in the Philippines, what we've done, and how we're using BRI to scale up resilience in the built environment in the country. Now, one thing I'd like to highlight is that despite being considered a low emitting country, the Philippines actually ranks as one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. What the IPCC found in their 2022 Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability report is very apparent here in the Philippines, in that as global temperature rises, so does the number and, as Olivia mentioned, intensity of extreme weather events, and also cities with the most economically and socially marginalized are disproportionately affected. So, considering the very high disaster risk for the Philippines, it made sense for us to pilot Building Resilience Index here in the country. So, in August of last year, we launched the Building Resilience Commitment Campaign, which is a call to action for businesses and organizations to collaborate to improve their resilience in the built environment. So, the Resilience Pledge, as we call it, served a dual purpose. It created a lot of buzz about Building Resilience Index, and it also allowed us to gauge the appetite for more resilient construction practices. And we received so much support from our private sector partners, who pledged a total of 1.8 million square meters of space, which includes 9 real estate developers, 41 projects, across various building typologies, and more than 9,600 housing units, majority of which are in the affordable housing segment. We are now providing them with technical assistance together with Omid and Aris, so that they can assess their projects in the BRI app. But despite our efforts, we recognize that we're still very far from where we need to be. In December last year, Typhoon Odette, international name Rai, and a Category 5 equivalent super typhoon wreaked havoc in many cities in southern Philippines, resulting in more than 1 billion, that's with a B, in damages. Now, all of these happened during the holiday season, and the Philippines is very popular for its very long and festive Christmas celebration. Unfortunately, a lot of people couldn't celebrate. Many families lost power and water, and many Filipinos lost their homes. And worse, more than 400 people actually died from that super typhoon. So, while we do not expect that we will be able to eliminate all of these deaths and damages when disasters actually strike, we hope that we can at least minimize them through Building Resilience Index. So, towards that end, among our many initiatives, we are conducting a damage assessment, sustainability, and resilience study for a hospitality project that was destroyed in Cebu, which is to the south. And we hope that the cost study will help unlock investment opportunities to help this project build back better, greener, and more resilient through both EDGE and Building Resilience Index. And also next week, I'm very happy to say that we are also launching a resilience hackathon, which is a competition to find achievable, scalable, and replicable resilient solutions in areas that were hardest hit by Typhoon Odette. So lastly, we have to continue with our mission, which we know we can only fulfill through meaningful cross-sector collaborations. So next slide, please, Amit. So it's very important for us to collaborate across the real estate ecosystem. And our work in the Philippines, as well as in the other countries where we are expanding Building Resilience Index, leverages on a four-part strategy. And to just go over this chart here, the upper left, the yellow one, talks about how we work closely with our investment and advisory solutions with financial institutions to create finance products that could help encourage and incentivize resilient building design and construction. The orange part on the upper right talks about how we can engage directly as IFC with real estate developers with our investment and also all of our technical advisory to enable them to create more resilient buildings in their portfolio. The green portion on the lower right talks about our work in codes and incentives. So we also are looking for opportunities to implement interventions in building codes, whether at the national or local level, to create that enabling environment and that good regulatory framework for resilient buildings to flourish, which I think is very relevant to the audience. And then finally, the blue part talks about the development of standards, tools, and platforms, such as Building Resilience Index, that would make it very easy and affordable to make our buildings more resilient. And just I wanted to emphasize that in at the heart of this mission is democratizing resilient buildings. And so we're not just focusing on office towers in key central business districts. We know that we have to work across various building typologies, whether housing, hospitals, schools, industrial projects, even airport terminals, so that we can really scale up resilient building construction as Aris mentioned earlier. So it's important for us to address all types of buildings to really catalyze a revolution in resilient building design and construction. Next slide, please, Amit. And again, this thread goes back to working across the real estate ecosystem. We want to work closely with governments to lower the cost of disasters, and this is something that we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of the governments, national and local, their revenues have suffered, and so we want to lower the cost of these disasters moving forward. Of course, we want to make our buildings safer and more resilient. And again, as mentioned earlier, we want to implement interventions for our construction codes to enable the private sector to better to improve the resilience of their buildings. We work closely with financial institutions to lower investor risk, to increase transparency and accountability in real estate investment decisions. Directly with construction developers, we want to help them to create a differentiation for their brand in the market. But more important than that is to help them understand what are the best practices at the national and global level for resilient building design and construction. So this knowledge was missing before, and we want to be able to fill that gap. And of course, we provide that disclosure system that provides a common language that various stakeholders can understand to evaluate the resilience of buildings. On the side of property owners, we want to lower operational disruption and to promote business continuity. We want to lower insurance costs and also to increase credibility with financiers. And of course, all of this work will ultimately benefit our building occupants who will be able to live, work, and play in safer buildings. And again, this is also from an operational continuity perspective. We also want to highlight the importance of working with insurance industry as well to reducing premiums, because we understand that this is also very important in enabling and encouraging resilient building design and construction. So I'm going to pause there. Back to you, Amit.
Thank you, Angelo. And the image here is for us to imagine that one day we would have our cities that every single building has a rating for resilience, right? And if we have this situation, then if we want to rent a place or buy a place or retrofit a place, we know what exactly we are getting into. And this is really important for many. We have seen many of these disasters could have been prevented. or life loss or asset loss. Here, I wanted to get to the last point in terms of call to action. So what we are expecting our colleagues in the IBRD side as well as on the IFC side is very simple. What we want is to build back better any project that you're working on that is either housing, schools, warehousing, any project that, cold chain that may have warehouses. In these situations, we can include building resilience index as a metric within the system to measure and improve the resilience. This is something that if you have any projects or if you're engaging in any projects, please reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to help out and provide the building resilience index to the projects. You can also follow the building resilience index on the website, on Twitter and LinkedIn. But we value the inputs from all colleagues across World Bank Group. Here, we wanted to pause and we would have a survey link that my colleague will send through the chat. Please fill up the survey link. If any questions, please post them on the chat and we'll or unmute and ask the question. We also want to thank our donors as well as our partners that have been enabled this project to get to the point that it is, and we are looking forward to improve this project as we go forward. I'm gonna stop sharing here and open the floor for questions and answers. Maybe while we're waiting, I'm gonna ask a question from Olivia. Olivia, in terms of the financial institutions, right, and the role of financial institutions, you mentioned that there are not many tools or products already in the marketplace. How do you see that this can help in construction finance as well as on the mortgage side? If you can please explain that, that would be possibly helpful for the audience.
Sure, Umid, thank you. Yes, indeed. So what we have seen mostly in the markets is that customers or borrowers use personal loans to do home improvements, but there's no specific targets as to how the work should be done. There's no check on it, etc. And the other thing that we have seen as well is that even if there's a building code in place in some of the markets, it's not always checked throughout the construction of the asset or the building or the housing. So I think using the building resilience index will, one, kind of provide that quality control and that end target that we want to get to in terms of getting to more resilient buildings and housing. I think it will provide some discipline and also some more market awareness, right? Because one of the things that we've also seen in our market assessment is that a lot of people are not aware as to what resilience means and what it could do for them. So I think understanding and raising that awareness with the tool and understanding what the risks are, right? Because if you assess a building rated R, then obviously this is if a natural disaster hits, this is probably going to be a full loss or quite costly to either the homeowner or the building owner, and also to the financial institution, right? A lot of them are using housing and buildings as collateral to provide the financing. But then you provide the financing, and what happens if the asset just disappears as a result of a hurricane or other natural disaster? So I think the Building Resilient Index really provides kind of that all-encompassing tool that enables you to identify the risks, to try to mitigate them, and to show also to everyone that these are the changes that you're making, and how you can enhance that resistance, and hopefully have enable that ability to cope and just operate and go through a natural disaster and come out of it, hopefully still standing afterwards. So I see a lot of advantages there, and I think the financial institutions will also see that.
Yes, absolutely, Olivia. Thank you. There is another question. Maybe I direct this question to you, Aris. The question comes from Catherine. She's asking, some traditional construction methods are well adopted to local hazards, and how are we going to account for those type of construction techniques? Aris, any advice on that?
Yes, I want to mention two things here. One is that the standards that we have set for the various levels are universal in the sense that they will apply to every country. However, the method to achieve that standard can be localized. For example, in certain countries they may be building resilient, but in a different way, different style. But essentially the integrity of the building, the physical integrity, is what the index focuses on and allows for certain variations of style, local custom, local materials, etc., but without compromising the resilience level for that. So in the process of adaptation to different regions and different locations, we are looking for those things, and this is a learning process. So sometimes even in the Philippines, I think we will make fine-tuning adjustments to the index as we get more feedback and learning from this. And obviously, we will also monitor the pace of climate change over time. And perhaps every 5 years or 10 years, you can decide on that. We will review the entire index and see, do we need to raise the bar even further going ahead? Obviously the top standard, the A, is the level that future building codes should be aiming for. They're not there now, but we are setting that for the future, and that bar I feel will be changing. Will be raised continuously, going from decade to decade.
Thank you so much, Aris. There's another question for Angelo, but given that the time is, we are at the end of the time, I would request that we have that question answered later. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks the panel here. It was extremely helpful. The recording will be available to all our colleagues, and wish you all a safe and wonderful day or evening ahead. Thank you.